of Guyana, next to Venezuela and South America, has already been turned into another Cuba, with atomic missiles aimed at the Gatun locks of the Panama Canal and at our cities here in the United States. Of course our government, which dances to the tune called by the Dynasty, refuses even to investigate seriously my charges on this score." End of quotation from Audio Book 1. Since then I have repeated my warnings about these Russian missiles in Guyana in my audio letters, as you well know. But when I first made these charges on radio, many of you sent letters and telegrams to the State Department, mostly by way of your Congressman and the Pentagon. You demanded to know if my charges were true, and for your effort you got gobbledygook and denials. And many of you sent me these letters, saying that you did not believe the government. Well, my friends, you were right. The developments which were destined to culminate in tragedy at Jonestown began some 13 years ago in 1965. Guyana was a newly independent country, the former British colony of British Guiana. At that time the secret Rockefeller-Soviet alliance was in full swing, and the long-range joint plans for a controlled nuclear war were moving right along. Both sides were looking ahead toward an eventual double-cross, but that still lay far in the future at that time. As I have explained in past audio letters, the deliberate strengthening of Russia at America's expense was part of their joint plan for world government and conquest. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 threw a temporary monkey wrench into the program when President John F. Kennedy intervened personally and stopped the nuclear arming of Cuba. And for doing that, he lost his life in Dallas barely a year later. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, made sure that he followed the script more carefully. In the wake of the Cuban crisis, Russia needed a new forward base in the Caribbean area for strategic purposes until the heat was off in Cuba. To accommodate Russia, Guyana was selected for this purpose, and David Rockefeller saw to it that a Marxist named Forbes Burnham became Prime Minister. In return, the Chase Manhattan Bank became fiscal agent for Guyana, giving Rockefeller access to the gold produced in Guyana. And as a key factor in all of this, then-President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 turned over the formerly American Air Base Atkinson Field to Guyana. America's right to retain control of the base for several more decades was simply thrown away without excuse. Atkinson Field, which was renamed Tamara Airfield, is south of Georgetown, the capital city. This is the airfield to which American helicopters carried bodies to be airlifted to America after the Jonestown disaster this month. When Johnson gave the Tamara Airfield to Marxist Guyana, he handed Russia a very large plum indeed. The Tamara Airfield is the largest in all of Latin America, larger even than New York's largest airport, the John F. Kennedy Airport, and its location makes it ideal for ferrying Cuban troops and supplies to Africa. As a result, Johnson's action on behalf of the Rockefellers robbed the United States of an important logistic connection to Africa, while opening the door for Cuban troops. Our troubles years later with Cuban troops in Angola and elsewhere in Africa are partly the result. For a number of years Russian military activity in Guyana was heavily concentrated around the vicinity of the Tamara Airfield. In fact, when I first reported the Russian missiles in Guyana in 1974, they were emplaced in sites that ringed the airfield. Within the past 2 years, however, the missiles were pulled out from these locations and moved to a separate missile complex west of Georgetown. In this new complex, the missiles were deployed at sites scattered over an area some 30 miles across. In the approximate center was a command and control installation commanded by Russian personnel. After this missile base relocation was completed, the missile complex was centered at a point about 70 miles northwest of Tamara Airfield, and roughly another 70 miles to the northwest lay the People's Temple Commune at Jonestown, an Israeli-type kibbutz. So the missile base ended up about midway between the Jonestown Commune and Tamara Airfield. It was no accident, my friends, that the People's Temple kibbutz was located so close to the missile base. But the origins of the People's Temple in the 1950s had nothing to do with government intrigues. It was not until about 1970 that certain elements of the United States intelligence community began to infiltrate and subvert the People's Temple. As I've explained in the past, it's always been standard practice by the Rockefeller brothers to support not only the faction in power, but also spies and opponents to that faction. In this way they are always in a position, at least in theory, to cut down anyone who tries to break free of their control. In the case of Guyana, the Rockefellers wanted to have such a tool in Guyana as a check on Forbes Burnham, the Prime Minister whom they had put in power with their money. Certain elements within the United States intelligence community, under general coordination by the CIA, were given the task of finding ways of accomplishing this. In the course of evaluating various options, it was concluded that the People's Temple would prove ideal. The psychological profile of the leader, Jim Jones, indicated that he could be converted into a powerful tool of our unseen rulers. Contrary to reports in the controlled major media, Jim Jones was born a Jew, and he already exhibited tendencies toward kibbutz-style organization that could be channeled into useful directions. This will be brought about through a combination of both conscious and unconscious factors. At the conscious level, money and powerful political support will be channeled in his direction. At the unconscious level, the technique of psychological programming, which I described in some of my early audio letters, would be employed. Gradually, Jim Jones would lose control of his own personality and become what our unseen rulers wanted him to be. The process would inevitably create tremendous internal conflicts and turn Jim Jones into a troubled and dangerous man. And that, my friends, was what was done. By 1973, changes in Jones' behavior began to be noticed by his friends and followers. His conversion into a semi-conscious agent of death and intrigue was underway in earnest. That same year the mushrooming funds of the People's Temple were used to launch the agricultural kibbutz at Jonestown, Guyana, though only a few people went there at that time. Guyana is a rigid Marxist police state, and no one could have launched a new enterprise like the Commune without its approval by Forbes Burnham. But David Rockefeller agents made sure that Burnham received all the assurances he needed that the Jones compound would fit neatly into the Marxist environment of Guyana. And at the same time Forbes Burnham had begun double-crossing David Rockefeller, exactly as feared. He was playing ball politically, but he was hiding much of Guyana's gold production in caves in the mountains. David Rockefeller found this out sometime later, but by then the much bigger problem was developing of the double-cross by Russia. So Burnham was left untouched in order to make way for bigger things. When I began warning radio listeners all across America about the Guyana missiles during the summer of 1974, the Rockefeller brothers were still in bed with the Kremlin. There were already ominous signs that something was happening in Russia which they did not understand, but they simply could not imagine that their old Kremlin allies, the Bolsheviks, were being overthrown. And so my public warnings about Guyana missiles were denied and ridiculed by government spokesmen who were lying. A carefully programmed nuclear war was being planned for the late 1970s, and they did not want the plan to be spoiled by public awareness. But 2 years later, Russia's all-out military double-cross of America began with the underwater missile crisis of 1976. Most of you know about that crisis, which the government kept silent about, but which I detailed in AUDIO LETTERS 14 through 16. Our unseen rulers were badly shaken by that surprise, and initially tried to reinstate their secret alliance with the Kremlin rulers. After all, they had succeeded in doing so once before, after President Kennedy broke the rules and made an issue of the Cuban missiles. But meanwhile, they also began setting in motion contingency plans to gear up for a possible real war. The Guyana Missile Base was one of the major targets of this revised planning. When this planning began more than 2 years ago, the space battle of the Harvest Moon still lay a year in the future. It seemed inconceivable that America could lose its secret beam weapons base, which was soon to be operational on the Moon. And so long as they had this Moon base to depend on, our unseen rulers thought they could not lose. But in light of the underwater missile double-cross, they wanted to be able to pull as many of Russia's military teeth as possible. In this way, their destruction of Russia would be even more complete than originally planned. The planners of Operation Guyana were given a difficult problem to solve. The objective was to wipe out the Russian missile base in Guyana, thereby removing the threat it posed to the Panama Canal and southern American cities. But this was to be a pre-war operation, carried out covertly and with complete surprise. It had to be covert, because neither the United States nor Russia could afford to have it known that the base ever existed. And the surprise had to be complete, because with even the briefest warning the base could be reinforced and defended by Cuban troops. From these requirements it was concluded that a commando-style raid would be necessary, something like the Israeli raid at Entebbe Airport in Uganda in July 1976. Any other kind of attack would have required that our leaders do what President Kennedy did in 1962, and that is tell the American people what was afoot and ask for our support. And at all costs the one thing our unseen rulers were determined not to do was to tell you and me anything. The problem then arose how to get the joint attacking forces into Guyana in a force large enough and fast enough to do the job. Wiping out a major missile base like that in Guyana, after all, is no small task, and it takes experience. It was concluded that somehow some very sudden, massive, compelling excuse would have to be provided in order to enable the secret joint military forces to enter Guyana temporarily. The excuse, whatever it was, would have to be so visible as to tie Russia's hands, so that Russia could not retaliate in Guyana without giving away what she had been up to there. And the excuse, whatever it was, would have to appear non-military, yet require military expertise. Furthermore, some provision would have to be made for all casualties in the missile base attack to be removed from Guyana after the raid. Otherwise their presence in Guyana could have been made the basis of an international incident trumped up around some different story, unrelated to the secret missile base. For example, the government of Guyana, following Russian dictates, might have publicly displayed the bodies of the joint military forces killed in the attack, and said they were killed in an attempted coup d'etat against Forbes Burnham. It was a very big order, but the Jonestown kibbutz proved to be the answer. All that was necessary was to arrange for many hundreds of American citizens to die suddenly in Guyana, and under conditions guaranteeing instant, massive publicity. The sheer enormity of the tragedy would require military involvement, and the location of Jonestown was made to order. Helicopters commuting between the Tamara airfield and Jonestown would naturally fly over the missile complex, whose details were known in spite of expert camouflage. This meant that joint Special Armed Forces could be set down near the perimeters of the missile base and later recovered, along with casualties, with relative ease. And as the reporters at the Tamara airfield watched helicopters leaving to the northwest and return from the same direction, they were led to assume that all were going to and from Jonestown, 150 miles away. They had no way of knowing that many of the flights were to and from the Russian missile base, which lay in the same direction but only half as far away. When it was decided to use mass deaths at Jonestown as a cover for the missile base attack, Jonestown was functioning only as an outpost of the People's Temple. There were not enough people there to provide a sufficiently major incident to serve the intended purpose. And so, through both direct and indirect means, Jim Jones was persuaded to go to the Guyana kibbutz himself, taking as many of his flock as would follow him. That turned out to be about 25 to 30%. And by following him they automatically identified themselves as the group most highly dependent upon Jones personally. They were also most susceptible to the combined influences of exhaustion, intimidation, and isolation from outside help, in other words, ripe for brainwashing. And ever since the days of the Korean War, it's been known conclusively that brainwashing techniques can force many people to do all kinds of things. Even hardened American GIs in Korea